July 4th, 1806. A sun-baked plain in southern Italy. 5,000 British soldiers stood in a thin red line, watching 6,000 French veterans march towards them in massive columns. The French had conquered Europe. They'd shattered Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They'd never lost to British infantry in open battle. Napoleon's system, column attack with overwhelming momentum, had defeated every army that faced it. The British commander, Sir John Stuart, had deployed his men in a formation the French considered obsolete. A two-rank line, just 2 men deep, stretching across the field. The French columns were 20 or 30 men deep, a battering ram of bayonets and revolutionary fervour. As the French drums beat and their columns advanced, every military theorist in Europe would have predicted a French victory. Column attack had proven unstoppable for 15 years. Then the British opened fire, and in the next 90 minutes, everything Europe thought it knew about modern warfare was proven wrong. This is the story of the Battle of Maida. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the battle that changed everything, the moment when British infantry proved they could beat the French at their own game. Because Maida wasn't about clever strategy or fortunate circumstances. It was about British musketry, British discipline, and the tactical system Britain had perfected over decades, proving superior to the revolutionary methods that had dominated European battlefields. But before we get to that devastating British volley fire, before we watch French columns shatter under British firepower, we need to understand why this battle mattered so much. Because without knowing Napoleon's dominance in 1806 and Britain's uncertainty about facing French infantry, you can't appreciate what this victory achieved. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the battles that defined Britain, the victories that proved British superiority, the moments when training and discipline defeated overwhelming odds, the days that built an empire. Let's go back to late 1805, when Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He'd crowned himself emperor. He'd defeated Austria and Russia at Austerlitz in December 1805, perhaps his greatest victory. The Third Coalition against France had collapsed. Austria sued for peace. Russia retreated eastward. Prussia remained neutral. Napoleon controlled France, the Low Countries, the Rhineland, northern Italy, and increasingly dominated Spain and the German states. Only Britain remained at war with France, and Britain fought primarily at sea. Napoleon's military system seemed unstoppable. His Grand Army moved faster than any force in Europe. His core system allowed independent operation and rapid concentration. But most importantly, his tactical system, column attack supported by massed artillery and covered by skirmishers, had defeated every continental army. The French column attack was revolutionary, literally. It emerged from the chaos of the French Revolution, when France lacked time to train troops in complex linear tactics. Instead, French armies massed men in columns, threw them forward with revolutionary enthusiasm, and overwhelmed their enemies through speed and shock. It worked brilliantly against continental armies. Austrian, Prussian, and Russian infantry, trained in rigid linear formations, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the French system. French columns would fix enemy lines with massed artillery, swarm them with skirmishers, then smash through with column attacks at the decisive point. The momentum and mass of the column, hundreds of men in a formation 20 or 30 ranks deep, would break enemy lines through shock and numbers. It was Napoleonic warfare at its finest, and it had conquered Europe. Britain watched from across the Channel with growing concern. British troops had fought the French in the Low Countries in the 1790s, with mixed results, mostly defensive actions or retreats. At Alexandria in 1801, British infantry had defeated French forces, but that battle involved complex tactical situations, including back-to-back fighting when surrounded. What Britain hadn't proven was whether British line infantry, in open battle using standard formations, could defeat French column attacks. And that question mattered, because if British infantry couldn't beat French infantry in straightforward combat, Britain's army was strategically useless for continental warfare. The British Army had developed its own tactical system over decades of colonial warfare. British infantry fought in line formation, 2 ranks deep in the Napoleonic era, sometimes 3 ranks in earlier periods. This thin line maximised firepower. Every man could fire his musket. British soldiers were trained to incredible standards in musketry, loading and firing faster than any army in Europe. The Brown Bess musket in British hands could fire 4 aimed shots per minute, sometimes 5 with experienced soldiers. French infantry in column formation could manage perhaps 2 shots per minute from the front ranks, with rear ranks unable to fire at all. But firepower meant nothing if the line broke before delivering it. Continental theorists argued that columns were superior because their mass and momentum would break linear formations before superior firepower could take effect. The psychological impact of hundreds of men charging, with levelled bayonets, drums beating, officers shouting "En avant!" That shock was supposed to shatter thin lines before British musketry could stop them. This was Napoleon's bet: momentum and morale over firepower and discipline. In 1806, that bet seemed safe. Napoleon's system had proven itself repeatedly. Britain needed to prove its system could work too. The opportunity came in southern Italy, in the Kingdom of Naples, where British forces had landed to support the Bourbon regime against French occupation. The situation in Italy was complex. Napoleon had placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Naples, displacing the Bourbon monarchy. The legitimate Bourbon king had fled to Sicily, protected by British naval power. Southern Italy, Calabria in particular, was in revolt against French occupation. The population resented French rule, French taxation, French interference with the Catholic Church. Guerrilla warfare raged across the mountains. French forces controlled the cities, but couldn't pacify the countryside. Britain saw an opportunity. A small expedition to Calabria might support the insurgency, tie down French troops, and potentially restore the Bourbons. More importantly, it would test British infantry against French veterans in open battle. If British troops could win, it would prove the viability of British military intervention on the continent. If they lost, Britain would know its army wasn't ready for large-scale continental warfare. The expedition to Calabria was both a strategic probe and a tactical experiment. Sir John Stuart commanded the British expedition, about 5,200 troops, including British regulars and some Sicilian auxiliaries. Stuart was a competent, experienced officer, but not a military genius. His advantage was that he commanded British professional soldiers, volunteers who'd chosen military life, trained to high standards, disciplined through years of service. These were the same type of soldiers who'd fought at Alexandria in 1801, and who would later fight under Wellington in the Peninsular War. The French force in Calabria numbered about 6,000 to 7,000 troops under General Jean Reynier. Reynier was an experienced officer, a veteran of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, competent and aggressive. His troops were French regulars, volunteers and conscripts who'd been forged into effective soldiers through Napoleon's system. They'd marched with Napoleon's armies. They'd won battles. They knew how to execute column attacks. They expected to win. On July 4th, 1806, the two forces met on the plain of Maida in Calabria, southern Italy. It was summer. The sun beat down on a dry, dusty plain. Stuart deployed his British infantry in line formation, the classic British deployment. 2 ranks deep, men shoulder to shoulder, stretching across the plain. Light infantry secured the flanks. A small cavalry force waited in reserve. The formation looked thin, vulnerable, almost fragile compared to the massive French columns forming opposite them. Reynier deployed in standard Napoleonic fashion. His infantry formed in columns, massive formations of men, each column perhaps 20 to 30 ranks deep. The plan was simple: advance with drums beating, skirmishers screening the front, columns moving forward with unstoppable momentum. Break the British line through shock and mass. Roll up their flanks. Destroy their army. It was the system that had worked across Europe for 15 years. The French advanced. Drums beat the pas de charge, the attack rhythm that had carried French armies to victory across a continent. Skirmishers moved ahead of the columns, firing at the British line, trying to provoke disorder. The columns came on steadily, hundreds of men moving in perfect formation, bayonets glittering, tricolour flags flying. It must have been intimidating for the British soldiers watching this mass of men advancing toward their thin line. But the British stood firm. Officers steadied their men, sergeants dressed the ranks, and Stuart had given clear orders: wait for the command, aim low, fire together. The British soldiers understood their task. Their entire tactical system depended on delivering devastating volleys at close range. Too soon and the French would survive the fire and hit home with their charge. Too late, and the momentum of the column would carry French bayonets into British ranks before musketry could stop them. Timing was everything. The French came closer. 50 yards. 40. The British could see individual faces now, hear the French officers shouting encouragement, see the front ranks of the columns levelling bayonets. Still the British waited. 30 yards. The range where musket fire became truly effective against massed targets. Then Stuart gave the command. Fire. The British line erupted. Thousands of muskets firing simultaneously. Not a rolling volley, but a coordinated crash of fire that sent lead balls tearing into the advancing French columns at point-blank range. Men in the front ranks of the French columns dropped instantly. The columns staggered. But British soldiers were already reloading. Ram the ball down, prime the pan, level the musket. 15 seconds, fire again. Another devastating volley crashed into the French. More men fell. The columns wavered. British soldiers reloaded mechanically. They'd trained for this exact situation thousands of times. Load, prime, fire. 15 seconds between volleys. 4 volleys per minute. The French columns couldn't deploy into line fast enough. They couldn't return effective fire. Only the front ranks could shoot, and those men were being cut down by British musketry. The rear ranks just pressed forward, stepping over their own dead, unable to help. This was the fatal flaw of column tactics against British line infantry. The column maximised shock and momentum but minimised firepower. Only the front few ranks could fire their muskets. The British line maximised firepower. Every man could fire. Every musket contributed to the devastating volleys that tore into French formations. At close range against a massed target, British musketry was murderously effective. The French columns began to disintegrate. Officers fell. NCOs trying to rally their men were shot down. The drums stopped beating. Some French units tried to deploy from column into line to return fire, but British volleys cut them down during the vulnerable deployment phase. Other French units tried to continue the charge despite casualties, but momentum bled away as men fell and survivors hesitated. The attack was failing. French cavalry attempted to intervene, charging the British flanks to relieve pressure on the infantry. But British light infantry and the thin cavalry screen stopped them. British discipline held. The line didn't break. Then Stuart ordered the counterattack. British infantry advanced with levelled bayonets. They didn't run, they walked forward steadily, maintaining formation, ready to fire again if necessary. But the French couldn't face them. French units that had held firm under musket fire broke when British bayonets approached. The psychological shock reversed. Now it was French soldiers who faced the nightmare of British infantry, advancing in perfect order, drums beating, officers cool and confident. The French broke. What followed was a rout. French soldiers fled across the plain. Some units tried to rally, but British pressure was relentless. British cavalry pursued fleeing French infantry. British light troops rounded up prisoners. French equipment littered the battlefield. Muskets, packs, shakoes abandoned by soldiers desperate to escape. Some French units maintained enough cohesion to conduct a fighting withdrawal, but the army as a whole had been shattered. Régnier couldn't rally his men for a counterattack. The French retreat continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Within 90 minutes of first contact, the Battle of Maida was over. British victory was complete and undeniable. The casualty figures told the story. British losses were about 330 men, killed and wounded. French losses exceeded 2,000. Perhaps 700 killed, 1,000 wounded, and hundreds captured. The disparity reflected the effectiveness of British musketry and the vulnerability of column tactics against disciplined line infantry. The French had attacked expecting victory. They'd been shattered. the immediate strategic consequences were limited. The British expedition didn't conquer all of southern Italy or threaten Napoleon's position, but the psychological and tactical consequences were enormous. Maida proved that British infantry could defeat French infantry in open battle using standard tactics. The myth of French invincibility was broken. The British system, line formation, superior musketry, iron discipline was validated. News of Maida spread across Europe. Spain and Portugal, groaning under French occupation, took heart. If British troops could beat the French, resistance was possible. Austrians and Prussians, considering whether to challenge Napoleon again, learned that the French system wasn't unbeatable. British confidence soared. The army had proven itself against Napoleon's veterans. When Britain committed troops to the Peninsular War in 1808, soldiers went knowing that Maida had shown British tactics worked. Military analysts studied Maida intensely. The battle became a textbook example of line versus column tactics. British observers saw validation of their training methods and tactical doctrine. French observers recognised they couldn't simply rely on column attacks against British infantry. They'd need new approaches. Napoleon himself later complained about British musketry and the difficulties of defeating British line infantry. Maida was the first clear demonstration of why. The battle also validated decades of British army training. The superior musketry that devastated French columns didn't come from special weapons or secret tactics. It came from drilling. British soldiers practiced loading and firing until they could do it mechanically under the most intense pressure. They practiced formation movements until they could maintain line integrity while advancing or falling back. They practiced enough that when French columns came at them on that hot July day in Italy, they did exactly what training had prepared them to do: stand firm, wait for the command, and fire devastating volleys on order. This was fundamentally what distinguished British infantry from continental armies. Other nations had good soldiers. France had revolutionary enthusiasm and Napoleonic brilliance. But British soldiers were professionals who'd volunteered for military life and been trained to exceptional standards. That professionalism showed at Maida. No panic, no breaking under pressure, just mechanical execution of drills they'd practiced thousands of times. Maida also demonstrated British tactical flexibility. Stuart's deployment was textbook. Line infantry in the centre, light infantry on the flanks, cavalry in reserve. When French attacked, British responded appropriately. When French broke, British pursued effectively. There was no complicated manoeuvring or brilliant tactical innovation, just solid professional execution of basic tactics. And that proved sufficient against French column attacks. For the French, Maida was a harsh lesson. General Reynier's career survived, but the defeat stung. French military thought had to adapt. Column tactics remained important in Napoleonic warfare, but French commanders learned they couldn't simply march columns at British lines, expecting shock and momentum to prevail. They'd need combined arms, artillery preparation, cavalry support, careful timing. British musketry demanded respect. The legacy of Maida extended through the Peninsular War. When Wellington landed in Portugal in 1808 and began his campaign against French forces in Iberia, he employed the same basic system that had won at Maida. British infantry in line, superior firepower, iron discipline. At Vimeiro, Talavera, Busaco, Salamanca and Vitoria, British line infantry repeatedly defeated French column attacks using the tactics proven at Maida. Wellington refined the system, adding reverse slope positioning and combined arms coordination, but the core remained: British musketry and discipline against French momentum. Maida deserves recognition as the foundational victory that proved British tactics worked. Without Maida, Britain's commitment to the Peninsular War might have been more tentative. With Maida, British commanders knew their soldiers could win. The army went into the Peninsular War confident that British infantry in line formation, properly led and supported, could defeat any French force they encountered. That confidence, first gained at Maida, contributed to every subsequent British victory against Napoleon's armies. For British military history, Maida holds special significance. It was the first proof that British infantry could defeat Napoleon's system. It validated British tactical doctrine and training methods, and it set the pattern for the victories that would eventually defeat Napoleon himself. That hot July day in southern Italy, when 5,200 British soldiers stood in a thin red line and shattered 6,000 French veterans in 90 minutes, changed the course of the Napoleonic Wars. It proved that discipline and firepower could beat momentum and mass. It proved that British soldiers, properly led, were second to none. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the battles where British troops proved their superiority through discipline and training, the moments when the British system demonstrated its effectiveness, the victories that showed why British soldiers were respected and feared across Europe, then you know what to do. These stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve to be told.